In the 2nd century CE, Rome poured a wall into the sea, and it is still standing, not as rubble, not as ruins that archaeologists rope off and photograph, as a functioning breakwater, solid, intact, resistant to 2,000 years of tidal pressure, saltwater erosion, and the kind of stress that reduces modern concrete structures to crumbling facades within decades. The harbour at Caesarea Maritima, built under Herod the Great using Roman engineering, is one of the most durable man-made structures ever constructed. And when scientists finally drilled into its submerged blocks and analyzed the material, they found something that should have triggered a global conversation. The concrete was not just surviving the ocean, it was growing stronger inside it. Modern concrete, the material we use to build everything from motorway bridges to hospital foundations, deteriorates in seawater. Chloride ions penetrate the surface and corrode the steel reinforcement within. Coastal structures have an expected lifespan measured in decades before they require expensive rehabilitation or demolition. The Romans had no steel reinforcement. They had no Portland cement. What they had was a volcanic ash called pozzolana, harvested near the Bay of Naples, combined with seawater and lime in proportions that triggered a chemical reaction. The modern world did not understand or replicate until 2023. 2,000 years of concrete science, and we were only just catching up. The question that nobody in the mainstream conversation seems willing to sit with is this: if the Romans had solved one of the most persistent engineering problems in human history, why did that solution disappear? Not evolve, not get refined and passed forward, disappear. And if you think concrete is an isolated case, wait, because the Romans had also solved central heating, public sanitation, daily journalism, microsurgery, earthquake detection, precision metallurgy, and urban road engineering. Every single one of those solutions was lost after the fall of the Western Empire in 476 CE. Every single one of them had to be painfully rediscovered, in some cases more than 1,000 years later, and every single disappearance follows the same pattern. This is the story of 10 Roman inventions that vanished, what their loss cost the world, and why that erasure may not have been as accidental as history asks you to believe. But here is the part that the history books consistently skip. The fall of Rome was not a single catastrophic event. It was a slow administrative and political collapse over roughly 2 centuries. The infrastructure did not fall apart overnight. The roads were still there. The aqueducts were still flowing. The concrete was still standing. What was lost was not the physical evidence of Roman ingenuity. What was lost was the knowledge network that allowed it to be maintained, replicated, and transmitted. Libraries were burned or abandoned. Scholars dispersed or were silenced. And the institution that filled the power vacuum left by Rome, namely the Church, had a deeply complicated relationship with empirical knowledge. Texts that contradicted theological doctrine were suppressed. Engineers were not saints. Scientists were not celebrated. And the practical knowledge of how to build, how to heal, how to channel water and heat a building and refine metal quietly disappeared from the official record. Some of it survived in fragments, scattered manuscripts, Arabic translations of Greek and Roman texts that were preserved in the Islamic Golden Age while Europe was burning books. But those fragments were incomplete, orphaned from the practical context that gave them meaning. Knowing that the Romans used volcanic ash in their concrete does not tell you the ratios, the preparation method, the specific geological source, the curing conditions. Knowledge without its full context is not knowledge. It is a rumor of knowledge. And for over 1,000 years, that is all the medieval world had. Rumors of a civilization that had once solved problems they could not even fully articulate. Now consider what that gap cost. Not abstractly, in specific, measurable, human terms. The aqueducts of Rome delivered roughly 1 million cubic meters of fresh water per day to the city at its peak. 11 major aqueducts, some stretching over 90 kilometers from mountain springs into the urban center. The engineering involved surveying gradients of less than 1 degree across terrain that included valleys, rivers, and mountain ridges. The construction of inverted siphons, covered channels, and settling tanks to remove sediment and distribute pressure. Rome's per capita daily water supply was, by modern estimates, higher than that of many contemporary European cities today. It was not just functional, It was extraordinary. By the 6th century, those aqueducts were collapsing. The maintenance knowledge was gone. The engineering expertise had fragmented and dispersed. Medieval European cities reverted to rivers, wells, and rain collection. Fresh water was scarce, contaminated, and unevenly distributed. Waterborne disease became endemic. And here is the statistic that should stop you. Historians estimate that the population of the city of Rome itself dropped from approximately 1 million at its peak to around 20,000 by the early medieval period. Not because of a single catastrophic event, but because the infrastructure that made dense urban life possible had been allowed to die, and the knowledge of how to rebuild it had followed. That is not a footnote in history. That is a civilizational catastrophe with a specific, identifiable cause. The loss of Roman hydraulic engineering knowledge did not just inconvenience people, it killed them by the hundreds of thousands, across generations, in ways so gradual and so diffuse that no single death could be assigned to it. Waterborne illness does not leave a fingerprint that says Rome's aqueduct knowledge was suppressed. But the death toll is there, embedded in the demographic records of the early medieval period, if you know what you are looking at. And this is only the beginning, because concrete and aqueducts are the visible ones, the ones that left physical evidence, the ones that were so enormous and so obvious that modern archaeology could not avoid confronting them. The 10 inventions we are about to examine include several that left far subtler traces. Inventions where the loss is visible only if you know where to look, and in some cases, the evidence of suppression is not in what was destroyed. It is in what was never mentioned again. Rome had a daily newspaper, not a newsletter, not a bulletin. A daily printed record of public events distributed across the empire, posted on whitened boards in public spaces from Rome to the provinces, covering military campaigns, political decisions, gladiatorial results, births in the imperial family, public executions, and civic announcements. It was called the Acta Diurna, the Daily Acts. Julius Caesar formalized it in 60 BCE. At its height, it was being distributed across a communication network spanning 3 continents. And when the Western Empire collapsed, it vanished. The last confirmed reference to it dates to the 5th century CE. The next comparable daily public news publication in European history would not appear until the early 1600s. An 1100-year gap in the concept of daily journalism. Think carefully about what that means. Not the paper, the concept. The idea that citizens of a functioning state have a right to daily information about what their government and their society are doing. That concept disappeared for over a millennium. Was it because medieval people were less curious than Romans? Was it because the technology was unavailable? Paper existed, writing existed, scribes existed. The mechanical printing press did not arrive until Gutenberg in 1450, but the Romans managed daily news distribution without it. What changed was not technology. What changed was who controlled information. And the institution that controlled it in the medieval period did not print daily bulletins about what the Pope had decided that morning. It controlled access to information as a mechanism of power, and daily public journalism was incompatible with that structure. The formula did not fade. It was recorded, catalogued, and then it disappeared. And that is true not just of concrete and the Acta Diurna. It is true of Roman surgery. The surgical instruments recovered from Pompeii, preserved under volcanic ash since 79 CE, represent one of the most shocking archaeological discoveries in the history of medicine. Not because the instruments are ancient, because they are sophisticated. Scalpels with interchangeable blades, bone-cutting saws with fine teeth calibrated to minimize tissue damage, catheters, vaginal specula for internal examination, uvular forceps, rectal dilators, instruments so precise in their design that when medical historians first catalogued them in the 19th century, several noted that the tools were functionally identical to instruments still in use in modern surgical practice at that time. Galen, the physician working in the 2nd century CE, whose anatomical and physiological work formed the backbone of Roman medicine, conducted dissections, described organ function, theorized about the circulation of blood, and documented surgical procedures in a body of work that ran to approximately 3 million words. He was, by any measure, the most prolific and sophisticated medical writer of the ancient world. And when Rome fell, his work was largely abandoned in the West. Not lost, abandoned. The Church declared that the body was sacred and that dissection was sinful. Galen's texts survived in Arabic translation and were eventually reintroduced to European medicine in the 12th and 13th centuries. But by that point, over 700 years of practical surgical development had been forfeited. The consequence is not abstract. Surgical mortality in the medieval period was catastrophic by Roman standards. Infection was poorly understood. Anesthesia was primitive. Post-operative care was minimal. Soldiers who would have been treated and returned to combat under Roman military medicine died of wounds that Roman surgeons routinely managed, and the knowledge of how to treat them existed. It was sitting in libraries in Alexandria and Baghdad. It simply was not permitted to be practiced in the places where people were dying. And this is where the pattern begins to emerge. Because with concrete, you might argue natural decay of an engineering tradition. With aqueducts, you might argue political instability and the difficulty of maintaining large infrastructure in a fragmented empire. But when you add the surgical instruments to the list, and the acta diurna, and when you look at what comes next, the argument for accidental loss becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Consider the Roman hypocaust, the underfloor heating system that was a standard feature of any respectable Roman home, bathhouse, or public building by the 1st century CE. The engineering is elegant in its simplicity. A raised floor supported by small brick pillars, called piliers, creates a hollow space beneath the living surface. A furnace, typically located in an adjacent service room, burns wood and forces hot air through this subfloor cavity and up through hollow spaces in the walls, heating the entire structure from below. No radiators, no pipes, no complex distribution network, just thermodynamics applied to architecture. It worked. It worked so well that Roman military outposts in what is now Scotland and Germany, in climates genuinely hostile to Mediterranean sensibilities, used hypocausts to maintain comfortable interior temperatures. The technology required no exotic materials. It required brick, mortar, a furnace, and an understanding of how hot air moves. Every single one of those elements remained available throughout the medieval period. And yet, underfloor central heating disappeared from European architecture for roughly 1,500 years. The medieval solution to cold was an open fire in the center of the room. Smoke vented through a hole in the roof, or increasingly inadequately, through rudimentary chimneys. Heat was uneven, dangerous, and dependent on maintaining a constant fuel source. Comparable underfloor heating systems did not re-emerge in European architecture in any meaningful way until the industrial era, 1,500 years. In a climate that made warmth a genuine matter of life and death during winter months, the technology to solve the problem had existed. The knowledge of how to apply it had been available, and it was gone. And that is only one building system, because Rome had also solved sewage. The Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer of Rome, was originally constructed in the 6th century BCE and progressively expanded and improved over centuries of Roman engineering refinement. By the height of the empire, Rome had a comprehensive underground sewage network connected to public latrines, private households, and industrial facilities, all draining into the Tiber under gravity pressure. The system was engineered with sufficient capacity and flow rate that it was largely self-cleaning. And this is the detail that should land with particular force. Significant sections of the Cloaca Maxima are still in use today as part of Rome's modern drainage system, a piece of infrastructure built over 2,000 years ago that is still functionally operational. Medieval Europe had nothing comparable. Waste disposal in medieval cities was a combination of cesspits, open channels running down the centers of streets, and direct discharge into rivers that also served as drinking water sources. The connection between contaminated water and disease was not broadly understood, in large part because the medical tradition that had documented it had been suppressed. The Black Death, which killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351, was not caused solely by inadequate sanitation. But historians of medieval public health are in broad agreement that the disease spread as rapidly and as lethally as it did, in large part because of the complete collapse of the Roman sanitation infrastructure and the knowledge base that had underpinned it. Tens of millions of people died in a catastrophe that a functioning Roman-style sewer network would not have prevented entirely, but would almost certainly have significantly contained. The pattern is not a coincidence. Patterns never are. Because we have now identified 4 Roman inventions: concrete, aqueducts, sewage, and underfloor heating, that required no exotic materials, no complex manufacturing processes, and no theoretical knowledge beyond what was available throughout the medieval period. They required only the transmission and application of existing knowledge, and that transmission failed, systematically, across every domain simultaneously, in a way that looks, the longer you examine it, less like the natural entropy of civilizational collapse, and more like the deliberate management of what people were permitted to know. But we have not yet reached the invention whose disappearance is the most difficult to explain: Noricum, a Roman province occupying roughly the area of modern Austria. In the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, it was famous across the empire for a single product: steel. Not just any steel. A quality of steel that Roman engineers described in terms that modern metallurgists have only recently been able to fully decode. Noricum steel was used for military equipment, precision tools, and engineering applications that required an edge retention and tensile strength that other contemporary metallurgical processes could not match. When modern scientists analyzed surviving samples of Noricum steel, they found a carbon distribution and microstructure that is essentially identical to what we would now call high-quality tool steel. The Romans had, by some combination of empirical refinement and geological luck with the specific iron ore deposits of the region, accidentally developed a production process that produced a material indistinguishable from the result of modern metallurgical science. The Noricum process died with the Roman knowledge network. The specific relationship between the local ore, the smelting conditions, the quenching technique, and the final material properties was never fully documented in a form that survived the collapse. The steel tradition of medieval Europe was, compared to Noricum, a regression. The specific quality of high-carbon tool steel was not reliably reproduced in Europe until Benjamin Huntsman developed the crucible steel process in Sheffield in 1740, 1200 years later. Consider what 1200 years of inferior metallurgy means in practice. Every surgical instrument, every agricultural tool, every mechanical device, every weapon manufactured in Europe during that period was made from steel of lower quality than Roman craftsmen in Austria had been producing before the 5th century. The limitations of medieval metalworking were not a function of insufficient natural resources or insufficient intelligence. They were a function of a knowledge gap, a specific, identifiable, datable knowledge gap created by the failure to transmit the Noricum process across the collapse. And then there are the roads. The Roman road network, at its peak, covered approximately 85,000 kilometers of paved highway across the empire, with an estimated 300,000 kilometers of lesser roads connecting secondary settlements. The engineering standard of a properly constructed Roman road involved a cambered surface for drainage, a layered foundation of compacted gravel and crushed stone, precisely fitted stone paving on major routes, and mile markers providing accurate distance information across the entire network. Many sections of Roman road that were not subsequently built over remain visible today, still level, still largely intact, still occasionally in use. Medieval roads were, for most of the period, functionally what the Romans would have called paths: unpaved, undrained, impassable in wet weather, without reliable measurements or maintenance. Goods that Roman traders moved by road in a day took medieval merchants a week. Military campaigns that Roman legions executed in a matter of weeks, bogged down for months in terrain the Romans would have crossed without difficulty. The economic and logistical consequences of the regression in road engineering are almost incalculably large. The Roman road system required a specific engineering knowledge to build: surveying, gradient calculation, drainage design, foundation layering, paving technique. It also required an administrative and logistical knowledge to maintain. All of that knowledge was available. It was documented. Vitruvius, the Roman architect and engineer of the 1st century BCE, wrote a comprehensive 10-volume work on engineering and architecture that covered many of these principles. That work survived. Copies existed. And yet the roads were not rebuilt. The knowledge was available, and it was not applied. For the same reason that the aqueducts were not maintained, the sewers were not extended, and the hypocausts were not installed. The institution that held power in medieval Europe was not an engineering institution. It was a theological one, and theology has never built a road. There is one more item on this list that stands apart from the others. Not because it is more dramatic, because its disappearance is, in some ways, the most instructive. The Romans had earthquake detection. A Chinese instrument called the seismoscope is often credited as the world's first earthquake detection device, invented by Zhang Heng in 132 CE. But Roman architects and engineers had documented, decades earlier, the relationship between building design and seismic vulnerability, and some Roman structures incorporated features that can only be interpreted as deliberate seismic mitigation. More significantly, a Roman architect named Vitruvius described, in his engineering works, the phenomenon of ground resonance and the transmission of vibration through different soil types, noting that hollow clay jars placed at intervals in building foundations could, under certain conditions, function as resonance detectors. It is, by any reasonable analysis, a primitive seismological instrument. Medieval builders had no equivalent framework. Earthquakes were understood as divine punishment. The appropriate response was prayer, not engineering review, not geological assessment, not structural modification, prayer. Entire cities were rebuilt on their original footprints after seismic events, because there was no knowledge framework within which to interpret the relationship between building location, soil type, and seismic risk. And the death tolls from medieval earthquake events in Europe reflect that absence in sharp, unambiguous numbers. What we are looking at, across all 10 of these inventions, is not the random degradation of knowledge in a period of political instability. We are looking at the systematic suppression of empirical and practical knowledge in favor of a theological framework that, by its nature, did not require or encourage engineering solutions to material problems. If disease is divine punishment, you do not build sewers. If earthquakes are divine messages, you do not study geology. If the human body is sacred and dissection is sinful, you do not perform surgery. And if the institution that holds power has an interest in maintaining a population that is dependent, ill-informed, and geographically immobile, then roads and aqueducts and daily newspapers and central heating are not merely unnecessary, they are inconvenient. This is not a conspiracy theory. It does not require a shadowy council to have met in a dark room and decided to erase Roman engineering. It requires only that we recognize what institutions do by nature. Institutions protect themselves. They transmit the knowledge that reinforces their authority and allow to die the knowledge that threatens it. The church of the medieval period was not uniquely malevolent. It was doing what every powerful institution does, managing information. And the collateral damage of that management was 1,500 years of preventable death, suffering, and stagnation. The evidence is not hidden. It is written into the architectural record, the demographic data, the metallurgical analysis, and the medical histories of every century between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. Every time a medieval peasant died of contaminated water, every time a soldier died of a wound that a Roman military surgeon would have treated, every time a family froze in a building that could have been heated using technology that had existed for 1,000 years, the cost of that knowledge erasure was being paid in human lives. In specific, individual human lives, each one of which represents a consequence of the decision, institutional or individual, to allow practical knowledge to disappear. The Renaissance did not create new knowledge from nothing. It recovered suppressed knowledge. The scientists and engineers of the 15th and 16th centuries were not smarter than the Romans. They were permitted to be curious in ways that their predecessors had not been. They found the Arabic translations of Galen and applied them. They excavated Roman structures and reverse-engineered the techniques. They read Vitruvius and built from his principles. The so-called rebirth of European civilization was, at its core, the reopening of a door that had been deliberately closed, which raises the question that this entire history is quietly asking. If it happened once, If a dominant institutional power managed to suppress an entire civilization's worth of practical knowledge for over a millennium, what is the basis for confidence that it is not happening now? Not identically. Institutions change form, the mechanisms of knowledge management change, but the underlying logic does not. Every era has its Galens, producing work that challenges the prevailing framework. Every era has its equivalent of the church, deciding what gets transmitted and what gets quietly allowed to die. The difference is that we now have more channels, more languages, more ways for suppressed knowledge to survive long enough to be rediscovered, or so we are told. The 10 Roman inventions we have examined tonight were not obscure. They were not fringe experiments. They were the engineering backbone of the most sophisticated urban civilization the Western world had yet produced. And they disappeared. Not gradually, not partially, not in ways that can be explained by the simple arithmetic of imperial decline. They disappeared systematically, in the same century, for the same category of reason. The concrete is still standing in the harbor at Caesarea Maritima. The Cloaca Maxima is still draining water under the streets of Rome. The surgical instruments are in the museum cases at Naples. The evidence of what was lost is everywhere. The question is why it took us this long to notice, and whether the act of noticing, the act of asking who benefits from the forgetting, is itself still considered dangerous. If this is the kind of history that makes you think differently about the world you live in, consider subscribing, because we are only just getting started.